Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited to be covering the Atlanta Hawks in an offseason preview. This video was requested on the channel by a few different viewers, so shout out to them for requesting this offseason preview. If you are new to the channel, I would love for you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel as well for more content like what you see in this video. And if you're looking for a specific team in an offseason preview other than the Atlanta Hawks, I would love to fulfill that request for you, so make sure to drop that down in the comment section right now and I will get to it as soon as I can. We already have a lot of offseason previews already out on the channel, but I would love to add more and more. This is the 22nd one we've done, so we're nearing all 30 NBA teams. Of course, 28 teams are done playing at this point, so we've nearly hit 100% of where we should be right now. So I'm pretty happy about that, pretty proud of the work we put into it. And let's jump into our video preview here. And for the Atlanta Hawks, we're going to begin with the season recap. That's what we do in all of these offseason previews, because I think the most important thing is to see where the team is currently at and how to kind of improve and take where they currently are and see them take a step forward going into the next season. And that's really the point of the offseason in general, is to hopefully improve the team, or at least have a long-term plan in place where in the next 2, 3, 4 years, you can see the team improve from where they have been or currently are at. Then the 2023 NBA draft, the Atlanta Hawks have picks 15 and 46. We'll talk about both of those selections a bit in this video. Very excited about that. I have some information on some pre-draft workouts that the Atlanta Hawks have been conducting as well. Then we'll also go into 2023 NBA free agency. We'll discuss what the Hawks have in terms of roster space and really what their contract table looks like right now. For the most part, it is pretty filled out. Then we'll also discuss a trade target or two in this video. I think it's an interesting discussion. Atlanta, a team we haven't really talked about too much for trade, so they've been brought up a couple of times. So I think really the one player I want to highlight the most today makes a lot of sense. And we'll see kind of what you guys think about it when we get to that part of the video. And then we'll conclude with an early outlook for next season and really what I expect for this team, not only next year, but also going forward just into the future in general. And I think the season recap, it was one of a lot of mediocrity for the Atlanta Hawks. They finished with a 41-41 record, and it was a real 500 roller coaster for them this season, specifically with the fact that seemingly all year long they were within one game of 500, whether that was one game below, one game above 500. They just never got out of their own way when it came to being a 500 team. They would win, then they'd lose. They'd win 2 in a row, then they'd lose 2 in a row. That's just how they were this season. And to be honest, it wasn't that bad of a year, given kind of the big changes that we saw from them. Of course, the headliner from the offseason last year, Dejounte Murray, being traded to the Atlanta Hawks. They gave up a lot to land him, but it put them in a position to have not one, but two dominant ball handlers who can do a lot of different things. I think Dejounte and Trae Young kind of lived up to their end of things. Trae Young averaged over 26 points a game and 10 assists, and also Dejounte Murray put in over 20 points of his own and over 6 assists a game, and they actually became the second pair of teammates to ever put up 20 plus points a game and 6 plus assists a game each. The first pairing was, I believe, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen of the Chicago Bulls. So pretty unique territory to be in for that grouping. Of course, there is some downsides to the way that they play as well, though. One of those things is the amount of passes per assist. They actually had the fewest passes per assist in the NBA this year, and that might not sound like a terrible thing, because you might think, oh, well, that's kind of efficient. Each pass is leading to a higher likelihood to be an assist. That is true, but it also showcases the fact that Atlanta is not a big-time ball movement team, as you could suspect, with Dejounte Murray and Trae Young, two guys who are more assist hunters, because they have the ability and the gravity to put stress on a defense to put themselves in position to score the ball, and because of that, the defense has to react and rotate. So it kind of becomes a, hey, Trae Young or Dejounte Murray are going to generate open shots, and once they pass, we better shoot it, and hopefully it goes in, because they're generating those open looks. But really, the rest of the players are kind of playing without rhythm. They're kind of playing without touching the basketball as frequently as you would see on other teams. In fact, all other 29 teams in the NBA had more passes per assist than the Atlanta Hawks. And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge for their brand new head coach, Quinn Snyder, who they brought in at the end of the year. Didn't get to see too much of him like last 20 games or so, and coached into the playoffs, of course. One thing I do think I believe Quinn Snyder was a phenomenal hire, and clearly he has the backing of Trae Young as well, which I think is going to be an important thing to keep our eye on. Trae Young and his relationship with the head coach so far in his tenure in Atlanta has been a little shaky. Lloyd Pierce, you think about Nate McMillan, sometimes really high, sometimes really low. And that's not necessarily a shot at Trae Young, it's just the reality, right? There's been a lot of conflicting reports about his relationship within the organization and things like that. I don't want to speculate too much on that because I'm not actually there inside the building, so I don't feel like I'm in a position to say, well, Trae Young's in the wrong or Trae Young's in the right. I just think it's something that we have to keep our eyes out for and listen for, because so far Trae Young has been singing Quinn Snyder's praises, and very deservingly so, because I think Quinn Snyder's a great coach, and I think he's going to do a lot of great stuff for the Atlanta Hawks. So I'm excited to see how he kind of tackles this challenge of, two ball dominant guards who don't really promote ball movement. Because you think back to Atlanta, or back to Utah, with Quinn Snyder, a big portion of those teams were predicated on ball movement and being able to draw in the defense, and then you kick the ball out and you get an entire ball reversal into an open shot. That's what Quinn Snyder really preached and practiced in Utah, and he found a lot of success playing that way. But he has had players in the past too that maybe are less ball movement-esque. Kind of think Donovan Mitchell, moments of his game where he wasn't passing the ball to Rudy Gobert anymore. You can understand that Quinn Snyder is going to have success here, but it's maybe not going to be in his preferred fashion. So there's going to have to be some workarounds. This team had also pretty good depth. In fact, when you look at Atlanta's roster, you'd look up and down, you say this is one of the deeper teams in the league, honestly. DeAndre Hunter, career high 15.4 points per game this year, I think took a pretty notable step forward in terms of his own individual production. And I think he's probably emerged as the third best player at this point on the team. You could also make an argument for Clint Capella, who had a fantastic playing game against the Miami Heat that ultimately landed the Hawks the 7 seed. And then the Miami Heat went on to make the NBA Finals out of the East, which is crazy because they were one game away from being eliminated, and all of a sudden they're in the NBA Finals. The Hawks, that was a huge statement game for them. Of course, they didn't really carry that into too much success against Boston. It wasn't like a blowout series or anything, but I think Atlanta fans were probably hoping for a little bit more of a competitive series. And then you look at John Collins. He's really the big pivot man right now for me in Atlanta, because I think if there's a player traded, John Collins definitely would be on that list. They've been trying to trade him for over 2 years now. He is on a very expensive contract, $25+ million. And earlier in the year, I floated a potential John Collins to the Phoenix Suns for Jay Crowder and a first-round pick, and Hawks fans explicitly told me, no, that's not enough value for John Collins. I don't think there's an understanding around the league yet, especially from fans, that John Collins is on a negative contract. He scored 13 points a game this year. That's very limited and low production for a guy whose primary responsibility as a player, primary skill set is scoring the ball for his position. Now, of course, with Dejounte there, John Collins' role just was going to naturally be reduced anyway, but I think it was reduced even more so than a lot of people were expecting. And I think that he's probably the odd man out from this entire grouping, which is unfortunate to see. And honestly, with some of the trade discussions I've heard between the Atlanta Hawks and Utah Jazz, Danny Ainge, under the assumption he was going to acquire John Collins, was also expecting to get a first-round pick with Collins, not to actually give them a pick. So it feels like the value from what other teams perceive on Collins is significantly different from what the Hawks are hoping to get for him via trade. So we'll see if he actually ever gets moved. Maybe he's just a salary filler in a trade at some point, which we'll talk about the possibility of that later on in this video as well. But I think that's going to be a really key thing to keep our eyes on as well. Onyeka Okongwu, kind of a nice big year for him, averaged nearly 10 points a game, and I think was probably the most productive he's been so far in his early career. I loved him coming out of USC because I think he's a really versatile, switchable defender. He loves to block shots at the rim. Really incredible highlight tape, honestly, of Onyeka Okongwu, and I think he's a guy that, as he continues to take steps forward, Clint Capella becomes more and more and more expendable. But I think Atlanta's kind of managing this fairly well. Of, look, we're not going to throw Onyeka Okongwu into the fire. That's what they haven't done the last 2-3 years. They've been pretty patient with him as a whole, and because of that, they've kind of gotten to see him grow before their very eyes without exposing him too much to other teams, and still having like a pretty good confidence level with some of the minutes that he has played, that he could be the starting center of the future for this organization, which is what I'd ultimately expect at some point. But Capella's had moments too, right? Again, I reference back to that playing game. That was a huge game for him. dominated Miami on the glass, but that's something he's done for a long time. He's also just a fantastic pick and roll partner with Trae Young, gets downhill well, and then also, obviously, even back from his time in Houston, we know that he can catch lobs and finish at the rim with the best of them in that way. So he's not the most skilled player, but he fits his role. He knows what his role is, and he executes it pretty well, especially as a help side defender, which I need to mention too. AJ Griffin, nearly a 50, 40, 90 season as a rookie. I believe he shot 39% from three, 89% from the line. So really productive year from AJ Griffin. And if you flash back to last year's mock drafts, I said multiple times throughout that process that AJ Griffin to me should be a lottery pick. Most oftentimes I put him as a top 10 level player in the draft. There was obvious concerns about his injury history and what that would look like. But now he's the son of an NBA head coach, Adrian Griffin, for the Milwaukee Bucks. Interestingly enough, is the brand new coach there and the father of AJ Griffin. But AJ Griffin, to me, his skill set was such a good add because he's got the physicals to, I think, be a plus wing in this league, but he's also got the skill set to be a plus wing. And when you really merge those two things together, an athletic but yet skilled player, those two things usually lend itself to maybe all-star-ish potential. Now, I'm not saying AJ Griffin's going to get there, but he's a guy that I think a lot of Hawks fans should stay dialed into, because out of everyone on this list, we already know what Dejounte and Trae Young kind of are going to be. DeAndre Hunter maybe still growing a little bit, but Okongwu and Griffin are really the two guys that I think could be staples for the next era of Hawks basketball, kind of around Dejounte and Trae. I think one big question for them, Dejounte is going to be a free agent, not this offseason, but 12 months from now. And depending on what next year looks like with Quinn Snyder, do they let Dejounte Murray walk for nothing? That would be a massive L for the organization, just given the fact that they just traded for him 12 months ago. And in a 24-month timeline, we could see them give up multiple first-round picks for a guy that would then, at that point, no longer be on their roster. And they would rely on Okongwu, Griffin, and some of these other young guys that they have to step up big time. Bogdan Bogdanovic would be another example. They have him extended. They would like to keep him around, obviously. But the nice thing is about extending guys right now is with the new CBA, you need to have money to trade if you're trying to improve your roster. And that's going to be the real tough thing to do. Lastly, the last player I want to talk about here, I can't mention every single guy on the team, even though I would love to. It just video would take an hour long, and most people wouldn't have the time to sit through it. But Saddiq Bey, they traded for him at the deadline, gave up a bunch of second-round picks to land him in what was a multi-team deal. And I was pretty surprised that Atlanta was the team that emerged for Saddiq Bey, just given the fact that they had AJ Griffin, who was having such a good rookie season. I didn't know that they would necessarily be in the market for Saddiq Bey, but I do think it's important to note that this was, Landry Field's first trade deadline as GM and acting decision maker for the Atlanta Hawks, and he decided to be active, and he traded for a guy on a rookie deal in Saddiq Bey, and he ended up having a pretty nice end of the season. Shot 40% on 3-point attempts for the Atlanta Hawks in his short tenure with the Hawks. So we'll have to keep our eyes on Saddiq Bey as well. Maybe a nice little pickup for them. Someone who I liked coming out of Villanova back in his draft. I thought the Pistons did well drafting him where they did outside of the lottery. Now Atlanta has a shot to watch him develop and maybe take a couple strides forward. I think Quinn Snyder's coaching could definitely go a long way, not only helping him, but also Griffin, Okongwu, and just kind of getting the most out of this young unit going forward. So when we look at their draft pick this year, remember last year, pick 16, AJ Griffin was a total home run. They move up one pick this year. They're now picking 15th overall, and I think that they have a good chance to add extreme talent yet, because this draft is super loaded with good NBA players. And some of the potential targets I like: first of all, Jett Howard from Michigan; secondly, Chris Murray from Iowa; and my third option on here, Jordan Hawkins from UConn. These were the three guys I really wanted to highlight most for Atlanta. There's other options that I could see them potentially considering, but just given how I'm kind of expecting the draft to shake out, these three guys, I have pretty good confidence that at least one or two of them would be available. I feel like these players address some key needs or fits within the organization, and for a variety of different reasons. Let's start with Jett Howard, who I think is actually a really good fit with Quinn Snyder because of his ability to do a lot of different things. He can be a high-level spot-up shooter. As we saw at Michigan, he shot about 40% from three on catch-and-shoot opportunities, which if you're thinking about building around Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, you need guys who can knock down their open shots that have been generated for them. Jett Howard does that. But in addition to that, he's actually got a sneaky good handle, pretty good crossover, and he's pretty quick with it, and he's got a good handle on it. So he's not going to get stripped a ton, and he's not going to be a player that turns the ball over too much. I think his usage is going to be quite a bit lower in Atlanta than it was for the Wolverines last season. But ultimately, Jett Howard, the reason he's intriguing here is with that handle, he can probably break down his defender attack out of advantage, which Trae Young and Dejounte Murray create a lot of advantage for your team, which is part of why they're so good to have on your roster. And then Jett Howard from there can kind of get you back into some of the elements that we've seen Quinn Snyder teams want to play, where they get downhill, they drive and kick, and they generate a lot of ball movement. And Jett Howard's also a fantastic connector, where he makes the snappy one quick touch pass over to the corner or from the corner up to the wing. That's something Michigan does very well. And, you know, you could also argue maybe Kobe Buffkin would make some sense here if he was a little bit bigger, but he's not. So that's why I went with Jett Howard, because they play somewhat similarly as connectors, but Howard's got a little bit more of that prototypical size that I could see Atlanta targeting. And for the Hawks specifically, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of give Quinn Snyder a young player that could grow into the roster he really wants to build and kind of grow into the play style that he wants to operate with. Kris Murray, this one's about paying off, and that's really the key thing here. If you're looking at paying off some of those Trae Young, Dejounte Murray drives, it's finding a smart, intuitive, instinctual player like Kris Murray who understands when to cut, but he's really a lights out 3-point shooter with that left-handed shot that he's got. You know, obviously we saw Keegan Murray light the world on fire this year for the Sacramento Kings. He had such a good rookie season, specifically behind the 3-point line, where he scored over 65% of his points this past season. And I think Kris Murray is going to be nearly as prolific in terms of percentage of his points behind the 3-point line. He's going to be pretty reliant as a catch and shoot guy. But again, there's not much better fits in the league than Atlanta, because they have two guards who can generate those open looks for the forwards and other players in the front court. And Kris Murray, if you're looking at the possibility of John Collins maybe being traded, or they just move off of him in general, Kris Murray is the guy that makes sense to maybe supersede him as a more pure spot up shooter. The ceiling maybe not as high as some of these other options, but the floor I think is significantly higher as well, and he's going to be a good high impact player compared to some of the other players around his positioning in the draft. And I think Kris Murray is someone you would want to bet on. Now, is he going to ever be an 18-point per game scorer? I would bet against that. But can he give you 8 to 12 points a game efficiently without kind of hurting the team and playing outside of his role? Exactly. He's going to play in his role all the time. He's going to make good, sound decisions. He'll cut when he's supposed to. He'll shoot when he's supposed to. He'll move the ball when he's supposed to. And I think that's a really nice positive here for the Hawks if they were to take him at 15. And then lastly, Jordan Hawkins. This is one that I'm very intrigued to see what Atlanta actually does. I think we're going to have a really good idea of what not only Landry Fields wants to build after pick 15, but we're also going to have a really good idea of how involved Quinn Snyder is or isn't, and what his offense is going to look like after this selection. Because if they go with a guy like Jordan Hawkins, who in this draft is probably the best movement shooter, did a ton of that at UConn, running off of a variety of set actions to generate open looks for himself. He does a very good job setting his feet while moving. Very tough thing to do, by the way. He does it very, very well. Atlanta finds themselves in a spot where you add a movement shooter to a team that they don't move the ball very much, like we talked about earlier. So instead of moving the ball, you need players to move, and you can generate different offensive advantage through that, other than just, hey, Trae Young, go run a pick and roll, or Dejounte Murray, go run a pick and roll. You can do other things. You can have Clint Capella or Onyeka Okongwu setting off-ball screens on the weak side. Maybe you run some more hammer sets. Maybe there's like literally endless opportunities when you have a player like Jordan Hawkins. You can literally run anything in your offense because of the gravity this guy could pull, even when he doesn't have the basketball. And I think that would really open up some of Atlanta's offense. I think they really missed Kevin Huerter more so than I was expecting, honestly. Probably one of the things I was most wrong about in the last 12 months was Kevin Huerter's importance to this team, especially once they got Dejounte Murray. He became even more important than I had assumed. Whereas I kind of looked at it as, hey, look, they added a guard, they could move off of him. And I just didn't really, I don't think, factor that skill set in as much. My hope then was that Trae Young would kind of run off screens a little bit more and do more stuff without the ball. We just didn't really see that much, which I don't think we ever will, which is why a guy like Jordan Hawkins maybe would make some sense, honestly, moving forward. So then going into pick 46, these are some players that the Atlanta Hawks have actually had in the facility working out for the team in the pre-draft process. And this isn't a fully encompassing list. This is just 3 players that I thought could make some potential sense that they've had in the building. This is, again, not every player they've had for a workout. In fact, there's going to be players that after this video even comes out on the channel, there's going to be more players that enter the building and work out for them. So it would be impossible for me to actually give you a fully encompassing list anyway at this point in time. But pick 46, some guys that they've had in that are notable. Oscar Tshiebwe from Kentucky. He's been a huge rebounder throughout his collegiate career. Now, there's going to be questions about his upside. He's not the most laterally mobile player in this draft by any stretch of the imagination. But the couple things he does do, he sets good screens. He works extremely hard. He rebounds the crap out of the basketball. And because of that, Atlanta's in a spot where if they were to take Oscar Tshiebwe, he would at least have a role for them, assuming at some point Clint Capella maybe gets traded or they kind of usher in that Onyeka Okongwu era that we talked about earlier. Tshiebwe could be kind of a nice spell big because he gives you that physical frame that I don't think Okongwu presents as much, which would be interesting. Jazzy and Gortman from Overtime Elite plays in the same league as the Thompson twins. He's a notable name just because I wasn't sure how many workouts he was going to get. In fact, he did have one with the Atlanta Hawks, so notable there. And then also Sir'Jabari Rice from Texas. He's been a hot name. He actually transferred to the Longhorns this past season, and then you see he's kind of made a name for himself, and people expect him to be a potential second-round pick. Now, it's possible, too, that Atlanta could maybe target him as a two-way player, as a UDFA after the draft. So we'll have to kind of keep our eyes on some of these guys. Obviously, this list, again, not fully encompassing, but still pretty good indicators as to kind of what type of guys they could be looking for. And to me, it seems like high-energy, high-effort guys who are going to work really hard. And I think that's what Atlanta needs a little bit more of, honestly, because this team currently has 14 players under contract before we go into 2023 NBA free agency. You also look at the fact that they have 2 picks in this year's draft. They're kind of full on roster spots right now. They're likely not going to be too active, but the one thing they're set up for is a consolidation trade, which we'll talk about here in a second. So just because of how this is structured, I just don't really see Atlanta spending money. In fact, my assumption is this offseason they maybe try and even shave off a little bit of money like they did last year with Kevin Huerter. Now, you might say, well, that's not a good move. We don't want to do that again. They might have to try and line themselves up to ultimately keep Dejounte Murray 12 months from now. That might be their end goal. That might be their aim. We'll see what they actually go out and do. But I just would be surprised to see them be very active this offseason. They've got a lot of guys on the books. They've got young players that are linked to the organization for quite a while. Most of them on rookie deals, some of them on extensions. But for the most part, Atlanta should be pretty happy about where they're currently at in terms of the players that they have on their roster. But if they do look for a consolidation trade, and I think this is a really important note, there's a guy playing in Boston that I think makes some sense, and it would be a homecoming return for the kid from Marietta, Georgia. So when it comes to Jaylen Brown, why does it make sense for him to play in Atlanta? Well, we already talked about the fact that this team doesn't really rely on ball movement as much. And if you want to knock one thing about Jaylen Brown's game, it's the fact that he's not a very good ball mover. He's kind of ball dominant in terms of like, hey, he's going to put the ball on the deck. And once he does, he's probably not reading the floor. He's looking to score and create his own shot. And he does a pretty good job of that. He's an all NBA caliber player. He's been really vital for Boston's success over the last 5 years or so. And I think if you look at what Boston's looking to do, Brad Stevens doesn't want to trade Jaylen Brown, but Jaylen Brown is going into the final year of his contract. He could be potentially viewed as a real flight risk, especially if Boston is not willing to offer that super max. To me, I don't view him myself as a flight risk because I think that they will offer him the super max and he'll stay in Boston ultimately on that massive money deal. But if not, maybe Boston doesn't offer it to him, or maybe Jaylen Brown just doesn't like playing there. Atlanta and a return home would make a lot of sense, specifically because I think Atlanta has some of the young pieces it would take to get into the door of a trade, like an AJ Griffin, like an Onyeka Okongwu. They have the money to match with the John Collins. They could figure out a way to get a deal done with Atlanta and Boston being the 2 main parties if they so desire. Now, it's going to take a lot, and the Hawks don't have a ton of draft pick flexibility, but they do have some assets that they can move, and they have young players that would have some value. And that's really the main starting point here if you're Boston. Maybe you could even throw out the idea of, what about Dejounte Murray for Jaylen Brown. I've seen people floating the idea of Trae Young for Jaylen Brown. I don't think that makes any sense at all, to be honest. I don't think Boston's looking to build that way, and I don't think Atlanta's looking to pivot off of Trae Young for Jaylen Brown. I just would be really shocked to see something like that come to fruition. I think a Dejounte Murray for Jaylen Brown makes a little bit more sense because Boston gets kind of a better defender into the fold than what Trae Young would present for them, and Atlanta kind of gets this another offensive piece that's quite a bit different stylistically than Trae Young, who's kind of ball dominant but can create for others out of it. They get kind of this downhill force who puts a little bit more pressure on the rim than Trae Young. Not a little bit, a lot more pressure on the rim than Trae Young. And then also just flat out is a really good driver of the basketball. So I think Atlanta, this is one to consider. Ultimately, if I had to guess, and if you actually asked me to put money down on something, I would say Jaylen Brown's playing for the Boston Celtics next year and probably for years to come after that. But I do think that this is the one player that was really important to talk about. You could also maybe look at a Karl Anthony Towns trade as a possibility, but I don't know if I'm in love with that. We'll see. Clint Capella, will they trade him? Will they not? I think Atlanta's kind of a big mystery team this offseason because we just don't have a long history of what Landry Fields is going to look to do. So there's more speculation than anything right now. And because of that, you just kind of have to take everything at face value. You have to weigh your options, consider everything that's possible, and then go from there. I think that's one of the things I do all the time, pretty much all the time. I'm thinking about basketball or talking about basketball. And when I'm doing that, I'm kind of actively playing through ideas and situations in my head so that in the scenario that one arises, I kind of know how I feel about it because I've already spent the time, I've already given it consideration and kind of thought about it. And then I kind of base my own value on, hey, what would I be willing to do? And then if one team overpays or underpays based off of that, that's kind of how I initially react to some of those things, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. So if you're a Hawks fan, maybe shoot me some potential offseason trades on Twitter. Links in the description for that, by the way, or join our Discord and leave some comments in there about who the Atlanta Hawks could look to trade away, who they could look to trade for, because sometimes having these ideas, it's really fun because it opens your mind to new possibilities. And I think that's one thing when you're a GM and an executive, you need to be creative. You need to have creative problem solving solutions, and sometimes looking into things that other people see might be the best way to kind of rejuvenate your brain and see something a different way, and sometimes in a better way. So going into next year, what does this team ultimately look like? I think Atlanta's one of those teams that's going to be kind of tough to project because in my brain, I think that, hey, look, the talent's here. It's just about how does Quinn Snyder make it all work together? And that's something I haven't seen yet. And when I look at it on paper, I think that they have the components to be good. They have a two-way guard in Dejounte Murray, who I think complements Trae Young relatively well. I think if they ever got Trae Young to buy into being a screener, this team would be really, really, really good. But without that, I think that they could still be very good. I still think they could be really solid. Does that mean they're going to be a top 4 seed in the East? Probably not. But could I see them being a top 6 seed in the Eastern Conference? I think there's a good argument to be had there. It's going to be kind of dependent on what happens with some of these other teams, what other decisions are being made simultaneous to the decisions that the Atlanta Hawks are making. But I think for the most part, you can count on the Hawks being competitive next year. Quinn Snyder knows how to win a lot of regular season games. He's also had some decent playoff success, not the best, but decent. And I think that the Hawks, I wouldn't discount them right now as a team that couldn't make noise next year. And I think there's going to be a long pathway that would have to lead up to that. I'm not saying I would bet on that right now, to be completely frank with you. Hawks fans, you might not want to hear that, but I'm not going to just blow smoke here and say, oh, the Hawks are going to win the title. I'm not just going to say stuff to hype you up. Yeah, I'm going to keep it a buck. I don't think this Hawks team is that good, but I think they're good. And that's a lot better than other situations right now in the league. You want to be good. The Hawks are good. They're in a pretty solid spot. Now, they don't own a lot of draft picks moving forward because of the Dejounte trade, but going into next year, they can be strong, solid, competitive, and we'll see what they do from there. But I'm really excited to watch this Hawks team next year, specifically with Quinn Snyder. A little bit more time underneath of him, a training camp with him, I think will go a long way. And I think the Hawks are going to be definitely better this next year than they were this past season in 22-23. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. I read every single comment on the channel, and I spend a lot of time working on these types of videos so that I put out good content that you guys actually enjoy watching. And hopefully you feel like it's accurate. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like what you saw in this video, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.